It was a late autumn evening when Sarah, a young woman in her early 20s, decided to take a detour on her way home. She had been hearing strange stories about a long-forgotten forest on the outskirts of her town, known as Black Hollow. The locals said it was cursed, a place where many had vanished without a trace. Intrigued and wanting to prove it was just superstition, Sarah ignored the warnings and drove toward the forest. The air grew cooler as she approached, and an eerie fog began to roll in, swirling around her headlights. Her car's tires crunched against the gravel road, and the further she drove, the more isolated she felt. Trees loomed over her like silent sentinels, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the fading light. Eventually, Sarah spotted an old, dilapidated cabin on the side of the road. It seemed abandoned, with vines creeping up its sides and the windows cracked and dusty. She pulled over, feeling an odd pull to investigate. The air smelled damp and musty as she stepped out of her car and approached the cabin. The door creaked open when she touched it, revealing a dark interior that smelled of mold and decay. Inside, the cabin was empty, save for old furniture covered in layers of dust. A fireplace, long unused, stood cold in the corner. As Sarah explored, she noticed strange symbols etched into the wall, symbols she couldn't recognize. Something about them unsettled her. There was an oppressive silence, almost as if the place was holding its breath. Suddenly, Sarah heard a faint sound from upstairs. It was almost like someone was moving around, but she couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else. Her curiosity won over her growing unease, and she decided to investigate. The stairs creaked beneath her weight as she ascended, the darkness growing thicker with each step. At the top of the stairs, she found a door at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, she gasped. The room inside was not what she expected. It was filled with old, tattered dolls, their glass eyes staring lifelessly at her. But what caught her attention was the old mirror standing against the far wall. It was large, ornate, and covered in dust. Sarah stepped closer, drawn to it, and wiped away the grime. For a moment, the reflection was just her own, but then something shifted. Her reflection smiled, but it wasn't her smile. The figure in the mirror grinned maliciously, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Then, without warning, the reflection reached out of the mirror, its hand twisting unnaturally as it extended toward her. Sarah screamed, stumbling backward, but before she could react, the mirror shattered, sending shards flying across the room. She covered her face, but when she opened her eyes, the room was completely still again. Her heart pounded in her chest. She rushed to the door, but as she touched the handle, a cold, clammy hand grabbed her wrist from behind. She spun around, but there was no one there to in a panic. She ran back downstairs and toward the exit, but the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Sarah tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The house seemed to be alive, its walls closing in, the air thick with something malevolent. Suddenly, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. She turned around, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, as though someone was pacing in circles around her. A voice, low and rasping, whispered from the shadows, "You shouldn't have come." Sarah's blood ran cold. She spun in every direction, her mind racing for a way out, but it was no use. The house seemed to shift around her, the rooms warping, the walls elongating. She was trapped in a maze of shifting hallways. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her ears. In a frenzy, Sarah ran toward a back door she had never noticed before. She flung it open, and for a moment, she thought she had escaped, but when she stepped outside, she found herself back at the cabin's front door. The fog had thickened, and the forest beyond seemed to close in on her. The trees twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, blocking her way. She turned to run back toward her car, but it was gone. The road had vanished, replaced by thick, dark woods that stretched endlessly in every direction. Panic set in as the whispering grew louder. Now accompanied by faint, distorted laughter, Sarah stumbled through the woods, her mind racing. Hours seemed to pass, though the sun had long set, and she was losing track of time. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and swirling around her, as if the very forest itself was alive. Then she saw it, a figure standing in the distance, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. It was the same figure she'd seen in the mirror, the twisted reflection of herself, its face contorted in a grotesque grin. "You can never leave," it hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers in her ears. Sarah screamed, but the figure moved closer, its steps unnatural and jerky, as if it were part of the forest itself. Her legs felt like lead, her breath coming in short gasps. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. The world around her blurred as she fell to her knees, exhausted and terrified. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the smiling figure, its eyes glowing with an unsettling red light, and the sound of the forest whispering her name. The next morning, the fog had lifted. No one could find Sarah. Her car was parked along the road, but there was no sign of her. The cabin remained empty, the doors swinging in the breeze. And in the mirror inside, the faintest reflection of Sarah's face smiled back a twisted, malevolent grin that would never fade to comment. And let me know that you have liked our story or not, and don't forget to subscribe.